Hi, and welcome to the Apocalyptic Optimist Podcast. Real talk about what's broken and how we fix it. Today I'm joined by Rachel O'Leary Carmona and Tamika Middleton from Women's March. And I think maybe if you're just starters to get us into this, your group has a really amazing history. It started with a march, actually the largest single day of protests in U.S. history, in January 2017. So I thought maybe we could just start with you're talking a little bit about the group's history and what you focus on now and how you each got started with it, with Women's March, that is.
Thank you for having us on. My first experience with Women's March was going to the Women's March. I was living in Brooklyn at the time, and I got in a car with some other folks, some people who were working and some people who were marching, and we drove, and we had a hard time pulling off. And once you leave New York, you get into Jersey, you can't pump your own gas. They pump your gas in Jersey. So there was lines out the Jersey, the gas stations, and someone said, "Ha, the Women's March, is backed up to traffic all the way here." And I was like, "There's no way that a protest in DC can back traffic up to New Jersey." And we finally ended up pulling in. It was when we got to Delaware. We pulled in and got gas, and we went inside to go get our snackies because you need to have your snackies on your road trip. And there was a woman, in the pink hat at the door with a petition, and she said, "Welcome to the 2017 Women's March. Will you sign this petition?" And at that point,
just so you know, I just got chills.
Yeah, and so did I, because I was like, okay, this is something different for a couple of reasons. At this point, I was kind of a cynical, movement person, but I had only worked in membership organizations, and I was relatively fresh off of a grad degree where I studied decentralized networks. And what I realized is that this woman from Delaware, believed that this mobilization was hers so much that she was welcoming me to her event at this gas station in Delaware. And I was like, this is a setup for a completely different thing. And so really, I could talk about the march in DC and everything, but I will say that gas station in Delaware was my first introduction into what I believe the heart and soul of the Women's March, kind of trajectory has been, which is that Women's March is a decentralized effort to prepare folks to go inside of their communities, to give them the knowledge of what they need to do the work that we need to do to get into motion for a feminist future. And so mine was in a gas station in Delaware.
It's amazing. And you're the executive director of Women's March, right?
Now, yes.
Yes, great. Tamika, how about you?
Well, I didn't join the team until 2021, but I am born and bred in the South, and have always been inside of Southern organizing formations, and that sort of like way in which we organize in Black communities in the South in particular. That's very sort of deep and relational, and I had been aware of what was happening with Women's March, and had been connected to some folks inside of Women's March. And then when Rachel reached out and said, "Hey, you want to come in, for a little bit, do a little, join the team for a little bit?" I said, "Oh, this is a really interesting opportunity for me to think about how we build at scale to meet this kind of moment. How do we build inside of a national body? And then also, how do we leverage national formations to support work that's happening on the ground in communities across the country?" And so that's really what drove me, because I had always been inside of these, Southern, either state-based or local-based or regionally based organizations. I had never really done, or organizing work had been like that. Even inside of a national organization, I had been really focused inside of the state of Georgia. And so I said, "Oh my gosh, this is an opportunity for me to think about how can we say, how can we build a relationship between what's happening at this national organization, the sort of platform that this national organization has, the connections, the resources, and bring that and be in relationship with organizations that are on the ground, and how can we create a feedback loop, and think about how we use that feedback loop to really build a movement to scale." And so that is what brought me in. In particular, at that time, there was the work that was happening around Jackson Women's Health Organization, and the work that was happening around SVA in Texas. And so it's really around building coalitions with reproductive justice organizations, and having spent a good chunk of my organizing life inside of Southern reproductive justice organizations, I was bringing that into the fold as well. And so I felt a um, really, valuable opportunity to say, actually, I think there's a way in which we can draw a bridge that hasn't really been built before. How can we build this bridge between these things? And so that's what I came in to do. That's what I have have continued to do. In my role, I'm the Chief Political and Strategy Officer at Women's March, and my role is really inside of the organizing work, and a lot of like, how do we build these decentralized networks that Rachel was talking about? How do we stay in right relationship to folks who are on the ground in communities across the country, and support the organizing that they're doing, and also say, actually, there are places where there aren't organizations, but there are people. And as someone who grew up in a rural community in South Carolina, I feel very moved by every time we have a mobilization, and there are all these folks in these small towns and rural communities who put actions on a map and say, what can you give me resources so I can make this thing happen? And there are only 10 of us, but we're going to do a thing. We're going to meet at a coffee shop. And I'm like, yes, I love that. So that's what I get to do at the Women's
Fantastic. So now let's talk. We're move up to the current moment. Well, not quite the current moment yet, but to last week, which seems like a lifetime ago. So tell us. I mean, really, tell us about the Free America Walkout from last week. Can you talk about what motivated it and what you hope to get out of it?
It does seem like a different world, because since then, of course, the largest strike in U.S. history has happened as well. But at the time we were thinking, Women's March always works better like operating inside of the cracks, and we know that we can pull a large mobilization together pretty fast. And we've been working for our last number of mobilizations. What we said is, okay, like the nut that people, over time, people and organizations haven't really cracked is absorption. So we get tens of thousands of people in the street. And so how do we get them inside of political formations? And we kind of had two theories of the case. And one of them is that we, started loading people into post mobilizations. We did this specifically at a very large scale with People's March. Is that on the tail of People's March, we had mass calls where we had three organizations, and they kind of made their pitch, whether there's immigration groups or gender justice groups or what have you, so that we could load people into those formations as well. And over time, we began to think that that is also needed, and we have to figure out how we begin to invest in in the communities and the works that are happening. So rather than focusing on absorption as a strategy that we're doing after these marches, and we're trying to build up lists or databases or whatever, if we're trying to strengthen communities, and what are the tactics that we do from there? And then that kind of led us to, okay, well, the tactics that we do from there that would remain central in different communities are a little bit more on like the non-cooperation, nonviolent direct action, et cetera. And so we were like, okay, so if we do that, then one of the things that Women's March did very successfully in 2018, I want to say, is the Enough walkouts. Again, that's like a different, if this is a different lifetime a week ago, that was a different galaxy. And so we thought, okay, so what could it look like to do a walkout? But without, the Enough walkouts were triggered by the Parkland shooting. And where, came very directly on the heels of that. So what could it look like to do a walkout where we begin to practice non-cooperation and practice having practice and an inquiry into what it takes to withdraw labor, withdraw commerce. What do we have? What do we need? How can we look at this both as a protest but also a test case for a hypothesis that we have, that the more you practice non-cooperation, like anything, the better you get at it. Which of course led us to having this conversation here today in the way that we're approaching data collection. It's similarly, and then of course accidentally, because we're living in Donald Trump's 2026 America, there were a number of moments after we, we didn't kind of separate it as cleanly from, big mass moments, because there are just increasingly mass moments every day. So that didn't end up happening as cleanly as we'd like, but we did get good information about, what is very clear is that the people are ready. and in a leadership posture. And now it is on organizations and institutions to catch up, in my opinion.
Yeah. Tamika,
And
do you
I,
want to add to that?
yeah, I mean, I think the thing that I'll add to that is one of the things that I love and appreciate about this organization is that while we have a big footprint, we have a small body. So it creates an opportunity for us to be the scrappy rabble rousers that can try and experiment with things that some of the other organizations that have the same size footprint can't because they have sort of different kinds of obstacles because they're just so much larger than us. Like we are a very small
Mhm.
team. And so we can take risks in ways that other folks might not be able to. And so we knew that there were other organizations who were not positioned to call for walkouts. Like they're just not positioned to do that because of the legal ramifications or whatever the sort of bureaucratic ramifications that we don't actually necessarily have to deal with in the same way. And
Mhm.
so it's provided us an opportunity to do other kinds of things, like to put pressure on different targets than some of our peers, and to pull different levers than some of our peers. And so when when we were setting up and thinking about what we're doing for January, because January is the anniversary of Women's March, so we're always thinking about what are we doing this January. We recognize that because there have been so many mass moments, that people were ready and eager in the streets, but also were very able to be receptive to what our base is saying. And so we're hearing from them in surveys that we send out. We're hearing from them in our emails. We're hearing from them in our comment section, in the chats, that they are ready to do something more. They are ready to take more action. And so, we felt like it was a time where, as we saw the administration escalating, that we could also be escalating and that we could take a risk in escalation that some of the other big national organizations could not do, and that our base felt prepared and eager to do that. And so that was
Mhm.
really sort of a push for us, and we had been talking about it for some time. People will say, what is the risk that Women's March is going to take? What is the sort of confrontation? Or we had been talking last year, as when we did kick out the clowns, we did the circuses last summer. We have been talking to folks from across the globe around what they have done to fight back against authoritarianism and what are some of the different kinds of tactics. And so we heard them talk about humor, and so we started to think about how we deploy humor and ridicule all last year. So we talked about kick out the clowns, and how this is the circus that is MAGA. And then, we heard them talk about dilemma actions in Serbia, and how, they were setting up dilemmas for the government or for people in power to have to respond to these dilemmas. And so as we sort of heard more and more of that, we heard our base saying, we are ready to do some different kinds of things. And so this was our offering to our base, and also broadly to the movement, to say, let's see what the readiness is. Let's see what the eagerness is. Let's see what the appetite is for this, and let's see what it will take for us to build a muscle to do even more.
That's fantastic. So, overall, before we get into a little more on tactics, how do you feel like the walkout turned out? Do you feel like it was successful? And if so, what do you use to determine that it was, in fact, a successful, outcome for you?
We um we were looking at, I was really going to be happy with 250 to 300 walkouts. I really was, because we were like, it's a Tuesday, it's January, it's cold, it's like all of the threats that our folks are facing. We hear a lot about the movement being tired. We hear, so all of these things. So I was really going to be happy with 250, and with 50 state coverage. That was my my hope and prayer. We had 950 in the end, and a lot that we believe were not on the map because we kept finding things on like Reddit and Facebook. And Tamika had noted, we are a team of 12, and so we don't have the human power to get on all of these different platforms to just scan. But when we came across one in our native habitats, we would send it ahead. And so, we have an idea that there were more, and we definitely had all in all 50 states. Some states had more than 100. That was wild. I wasn't, anticipating that. And so really, and of course, we're working with you. We're thinking through what the data says in the pre and the post. What is the impact of this action on our ability? Who is protesting? And particularly right now, I think we're Women's March. We're a part of a progressive and leftist ecosystem. Our particular mandate is to organize, women into being feminists, and then mobilize those feminists for political power. And so for us, it does not escape our attention that women are on the front lines right now in Ice Watch. I think that Renee Good's, courage and sacrifice will go down in history books. Naming also that Alex Pretty's parents put out that statement afterwards that said he was killed protecting women who are out on the front lines. And so I really believe that the insistence and the persistence and the readiness of women to meet this moment cannot be overstated, and I think is in direct relationship to why we hear so clearly from our base it's time to step up. And it's not to say that marches and big mass mobilizations don't have their role, because they do. But if we're thinking about how power moves out, and so our skill set has to move out and expand as well. And so as we're so practiced with marches and mobilizations of that kind, I think that we also have to develop that kind of competency for other tactics, including walkouts, including economic pressure, including corporate accountability, including all of those pieces, so that we can be, so that we're when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, but sometimes you need an Allen wrench or a screwdriver. So we need all of those tools, because it's going to literally take every single one to dismantle fascism.
Mhm.
Absolutely. We collected data. So we worked with you all. My team was able to collect data from what I think calculates out to be more than 15% of the people who participated. We have a sample of almost 7,500 people across the United States, which is great. And one of the things we asked them was about their feelings about whether the movement should be participating in more confrontational tactics in response to the Trump administration and its policies. 79% of the people who participated agreed with that statement, and 65% of them said they'd be willing to participate individually. So I'm wondering what do those data tell you, and how will that help to inform what you do next? And since Rachel was already going there, I figured I would just throw in the data before Tamika spoke.
Yeah, I mean, I think it feels like it definitely confirms a lot of what we suspected from what we had been hearing from our folks. And also, I think, to loop back to the question around the success of the walkouts, one of the things we were trying to figure out as we were structuring this from the internally was, how are we going to use the map, right? Because if we're talking about walkouts, not everyone, if I walk out for my job today, I might not put that on a map because it might just be me. And so that's one of the reasons why we anticipated that we would have a lower number on the map. But to see not only this number of gatherings, but also to recognize that so many people were walking out even beyond, like they weren't going to a gathering, they were just walking out, right? And we're hearing that from folks. And so it just really confirms that for us on a Tuesday. People are like, how do I make this work? What can you support me in figuring out how to do this? Am I calling in sick? Am I organizing around my lunch? Like, what can I do to make this work for me? And people were so eager around it. And I think that's really what the data does, is sort of confirm what it was that we were suspecting, and give us some more, I don't want to say, I hate to say ammo, but give us a little bit more of that as we're talking to other organizations, as we're talking to other folks in the movement around what's next, what our strategies need to be, especially,
Mhm.
I mean, I don't think we could have anticipated the way in which things escalated in the first couple of weeks of this year.
Mhm.
And so I think in this moment, people are very much watching and recognizing that this sort of escalation of violence and lawlessness on behalf of the administration, and trying to figure out what is next and how we get to next. And so I think the data really helps us to make the argument that our folks are
Mhm.
actually very much ready to take the next step. Our folks are very much not only are they ready, but they're asking us to flake them. They're asking us to
Hmm.
give them the tools, the trainings, the resources, the skills in order to do this thing because they want to take action. I mean, Minnesota has been so instructive in all the ways that people can and want to take action every single day. And not just what's happening, both what's happening in the state and the ways in which people are reacting to and responding to what's happening in the state across the country is so very instructive for us on what the posture is that we need to be taking as a movement and what we need to be doing as an organization. So I think it really gave us it really illustrates for us that we're moving in the right direction and that we have to take seriously how we prepare people for this next thing that they are wanting, how we make them not just because we don't want people to just say, I really want to do this thing. We want people to say, I want to do it and I feel prepared to do it. And so that is sort of what we're trying to be up to right now.
Rachel, did you have anything you wanted to jump in on since I threw out those numbers before my next question?
Yeah, I mean, I think that those numbers could be slightly scary to some folks who are still thinking that we're going to get out of this by voting blue no matter who. And and I'm and
100%, Rachel, 100%.
and um and I don't say that to denigrate voting at all. I just think that it's the floor and not the ceiling. You know what I mean? And I think that we have to be very serious about the ways in which countries that have experienced democratic backslide, like we have gotten out of it. And it takes, in the same way that we call for like a whole of government response to a crisis, we need a whole of movement response to fascism. And so while I think that we absolutely have to vote in the people who are aligned with, all of our demands across the board, I think that this data supports a strategy wherein we, in order to be responsible, we have to be preparing people with training so that they can engage in, you know, non-cooperation or a diversity of tactics um, that might stretch our organization's capacities as well because they're not tactics that we're used to. And the choice is not if we don't prepare them that they won't do it. They're gonna do it anyway. And so our choice is what we want our leadership posture to be or where we want to be in the in the caravan. Are we pulling up the caboose or are we leading from the front? And so I think that we have to really make a decision. And there are some organizations whose goal it is to stay alive as long as they can. When we're talking about service providers, like for domestic violence, people like healthcare, like legal aid, whatever. I absolutely think that they have a role. Actually, you should be, you should be protecting your, services at all costs. But what is very clear to me is that this data says that we need an ecosystem of organizations. We need an ecosystem of trainings. We need a skill set and a tool set that people can bring to the fight against fascism, and that different folks play different roles, both on an individual level and on an institutional level. And that if we continue to try to make all of our pegs square that go in square holes, that's a problem. If we continue to consider 501c3s, C4s as the locus of movement and don't pay attention to the decentralized networks like what, emerged in Minneapolis this time, Minneapolis last time, New York, in George Floyd, in Hurricane Sandy, in Occupy Wall Street, and at the different times that we've seen movements of interconnected and individuals outside of an organizational structure. I think we do that at our peril. And I think that we really need to interrogate the ways that power is durably built, and particularly in the face of a state that is willing to weaponize um, federal offices, officers, resources against us. And in order to be as sustainable as possible, as anchored as possible, as immovable as possible, as protected as possible, I I think we have to decentralize our efforts as much as we can. I think, and that takes a lot of willingness to say, I care about the movement more than I care about the things that I'm protecting there, whether it's my organization or, I'm an executive director. Every decision I make is like, I got payroll to make, I have insurance coverages, like I run an organization. And I think it's important for us to recognize the stakes, the roles that we play inside of the ecosystem, and to be very informed by the data that tells us that this thing is happening. Like the people are going to move. And the question is, will we be in formation with them, or will we be dragged along by the scuff of our necks as as movement leaders? But either way, it's gonna shift. Like the
Hmm.
people, in fact, have shifted. At 75%, that is a super majority of humans in a pretty large data set.
Absolutely, absolutely true. I mean, so here's a question. Now, I know you all were very, very involved in organizing the Enough school, like walkouts, which actually started. My understanding is it started with a big school walkout that was coordinated through the students in New York City in solidarity with the Parkland kids after the Parkland school shooting in February 2018. So during the walkout last week, we saw that most of the people who participated were overwhelmingly older adults. And in
Hmm.
fact, I actually decided to join the walkout on American University's campus, which is where I teach, because I figured it'd be a good way to get a chance to see the students. I know there are some very active student groups on campus, and there was not one student who participated in the walkout on our campus. Instead, we had professors like me, older adults from the community nearby who didn't want to go downtown because it was so cold. So I'm curious about if you've been thinking, at all about this issue because, from doing work looking at Resistance 2.0, we're seeing that the people who are participating in these kinds of larger scale mobilizations tend to be older. And if
Hmm.
you've thought at all about how to bring young people back into these kinds of movements, mobilizations, and how you see them coming into the fold, if you will.
Hmm.
Yeah, I can jump in here. I mean, I think, that is something that we've kind of talked about over some time, over the length of the time I've been at the organization, sort of who is our base, who are the people who are moving, and have been thinking a lot about what it requires to expand that base. But also, what I do want to say is one of the things that we saw and we were actually pretty surprised about was the number of high school and middle school walkouts that we had on our map. We had a number of high schoolers and especially up until like I I had the great pleasure of being our person who was vetting the day of the morning of the walkouts, who was vetting all the events on the map, and we would see a number of high school students putting things on the map that morning even. And so I think especially in California, but I know we had Minnesota, Minneapolis, we had high schools, we had, like I said, even middle schoolers. And so I think the question that we've been grappling with, and I think this is something that, especially because, we are a 501c3, has been a question of what it requires for us to organize young people, safely inside of an engine this big. And so, so that's what we've sort of been thinking about, and that's what we've sort of been building a strategy around. We're like, oh my gosh, these young people are so engaged, and they want to be involved, and they want to do this thing. And we saw that even in Charlotte, school walkouts in the end of 2025, and so that's what we've been sort of building a strategy around that, and also been thinking about what are some other interesting digital ways to sort of crack into some of these communities. Like we always joke about how nerdy our team is, but we do have like a team full of nerds, and so we're like, how do we crack into the anime young folks who are galvanized by One Piece and using the One Piece flag across the globe for walkouts and for protests. How do we talk to the K-pop young folks who are using light sticks across the globe as a part of protest? How do we get into to the fray with the gamers? And so we've been thinking a lot about how we activate, especially inside of fandom networks. How do we start to like crack into that space and not move people to action because we know they're already in motion, right? But how do we support them in coming into action inside of these larger spaces and actually using their fandom networks as ways to get inside of political action in very particular ways? And so, we've been in this conversation. Fandom networks is really Rachel's baby, going back to sort of Harry Styles' fandom organizing. And so we've been thinking about that, talking about that. We've been, some of doing talking to Trekkies and talking to sci-fi fans,
Andor.
and
Oh yeah.
or like the Star Wars fans. Exactly. We had one of our partners go to a Star Trek convention in Chicago with Trekkies Against Fascism shirts and like have conversations with people around that. So we've been really thinking about that space and also thinking about how we build out, in particular, a youth space where we can cultivate and nurture the energy and the activist impulse there, and do it in a way that feels protected, that feels oriented towards how we take care of young people.
Do you see bringing young people into the same, I mean, I know it's the same ecosystem, but how are they connected? And as we think about expanding the tactics that will be used to become broader, more confrontational, do you see, or do you think of it as the younger people joining kind of the elder folks, the Gen Xers and whatnot, in a similar tactic, or do you think that the tactics need to shift when you're talking about different demographics? That's my question.
I do think that young folks have an energy and an instinct towards confrontation in a very particular way, that we have to, like, again, nurture, but also support and guide. I have a teen and a preteen, so I know what that what that energy is. But also, I think, if we look at what history teaches us about the role of young people in social movements, that there is a space and a role for young folks inside of these sort of confrontational and escalated spaces. And we just have to be really intentional about that and really mindful about that, so that we are, not causing harm. I think that's one of our, one of our things that we're sort of keeping our eye out is like, how do we have the greatest impact, but how do we also leave communities better than when we found them? And so we don't want to be harming the communities that we're trying to be in relationship with. And so I think there's like a level of intentionality that has to exist there. But I don't know why that personally, I feel like the tactics have to be different. I think the approaches to the tactics have to be different when you're talking to different audiences.
I think I would add two things to that. And the first thing is that I don't know if it's about, I agree that the tactics don't have to be different, but I do think that there may be a question of sequencing. And I do think that we're seeing people who are willing to and able to be more confrontational in their tactics. Um, they're in a particular position and a place in life.
Mhm.
And I think one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is making refusal and non-cooperation sustainable and livable so that it doesn't wreck your life. And I think that, retirees are in a great place for that. I think Gen X is in a great place for that. I think elder millennials is in a, good place for that. I think the lower you get in the adult spectrum, the more risky it is. And the info I have on that is this summer, I have a personal relationship with one of my alma maters, and I was working with some alumni groups there, and it was the same thing. The professors were there, but the students were not. And the students said that they feared retaliation when going out onto the job market and inside of the schools, while the schools are inside of these battles, where people are being reported and things like that. And the professors were like, report me, you know what I mean? And the students were like, I might not get a job. And so I think that there are really real risks. And I think that's why for our walkouts, we saw high schoolers, we saw middle schoolers. Those are people who are still under like a protected, well, first of all, the idea that your record would be expunged at 18. Who knows what law is and what privacy is anymore, but certainly I think there's that idea. So we see the young folks who are still protected. And then we see a real gap, in the college age of like young adults who are just it's just too much risk. And I think it goes back to refusal has to be livable. You have to be able to survive it. And so if you're getting out of school, you've got debt, or, maybe you're lucky enough to not have debt, but you don't have a job. Your parents probably don't have the job. They continue to support you. The economy is not great. Like we are not, as a movement, we do not have the infrastructure set up so that refusal for those folks, or non-cooperation for those folks, is livable. It would wreck their lives, or at least for some time. So I think that that's something that the movement has to address writ large. And I also think that it is impossible to talk about young people of that age without talking about the ecosystem of where, how and where people get their media. And so when I hear about, political ads being run to the tune of millions or billions of dollars in this last election, I'm like, where do you get your news? I get mine from my phone. And if those are happening on TV, I question, like, are those, people getting any of our messages whatsoever? How are we breaking through? But then who is talking to them on their phones? And it's not us, it's the right wing, infrastructure. So I think that's why, so many of, voters of that age have drifted away from activism, or even democratic voting. It used to be a democratic stronghold, and all of those things, because of the impact of like the Turning Point USA's and their very effective organizing, and the way that they have scaled, honestly, in many ways, through decentralized organizing, their efforts to be much greater than the sum of their parts. And so I think that the data that's been pretty consistent, if I remember the data set across the board, is that, it's older, it's whiter, it's all of these things. And that also correlates with, these are the people whose life won't be wrecked if they, get caught or arrested or caught on camera or doxxed or whatever. And so what are the support mechanisms that the movement needs to develop, so that if that does happen, you're not just destitute?
Yeah, I mean, I think you make some really good points about the way that the right wing has done a much better job of incorporating decentralized networks to do outreach to young people in some communities of color, and through younger media channels, if you want to call it that, or less formalized media channels, let's call it that. I mean, one thing that I think is really interesting about the current moment is that, first of all, the young people that we're talking about, the missing young people in some ways, I think about the college students are the ones who basically, started paying attention in the first Trump administration, then had a big period of time where they were, in lockdown during COVID, and now they're back in another Trump administration. So their whole, I mean, they're not even an adult life, but their whole period of time that they have been cognizant of the world, they have been under these like very, very difficult moments, much of which comes under the Trump administration, where we had protests against, after George Floyd was murdered, we had protests, in occupations and encampments on college campuses against the war in Gaza, right? So this is where a lot of these kids tried to affect change and ended up with another Trump administration. So I think that they're a really unique cohort, and I think it's something, if you all figure out how to get them involved and channel them in so they feel like they're comfortable making change, and of course are not putting their lives at risk, please share it with everybody, because it's going to be so valuable. I mean, that brings me, I mean, I think we don't have much more time. I did want to ask you, so the other thing, and you mentioned this a moment ago, Rachel, when you talked about the data, it does tend to be that people of color have not been participating as much as they even did during the first Trump administration. There are a lot of good reasons for that, but I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about how Women's March is working to bring more people from communities of color in, or connect with them where they are, and help support and empower folks in communities of color to get involved in ways that they're comfortable.
Yeah, I can jump in here. I mean, I think that's such an interesting, it's such an interesting proposition, right? Because I think that a lot of folks, I think there's like a distinction between what is sort of the kinds of activism or action that is very visible, and the kinds of action and activism that I have been a part of for my entire life, right? And so, you know, I can recall a time before I was at Women's March where I would have never been at a large mass scale protest, but I've been organizing and been in the movement for more than 20 years. And so I think there's sort of ways in which, you know, people of color are always sort of in the, I think have been in the leadership around the ICE organizing, have been in the leadership when we talk about the George Floyd protests, like have been very active in organizing around police violence. And I think that there are ways in which, especially we go back to this question of risk, that Rachel was raising as well. There are ways in which that organizing just looks different, because of levels of risk, because of what people's lives look like, because of what feels and is priority, um, and what tactics actually feel tangible and feel like they move the needle. And so I think that is really a question. And so one of the things that I feel really proud of that we have always been up to is thinking about how we can support organizers and organizations on the ground. And so we flank folks in ways that we might not ever, no, people might not ever find out that we, move resources to the ground, we move training to the ground, we move skills to the ground. We might, offer technical support in lots of ways so that organizations that are led by and that are of people of color are able to do the things that they are doing in their communities on the ground. And so, we've done, like I said, we've moved money to organizations. We've run, trainings, specifically for organizations. We've done a number of things, and we've partnered with organizations and lifted up their work. And so I think there are all these ways that we are amplifying the organizing of people of color that might not necessarily translate in the same way into like these to folks showing up en masse in large protest spaces. And so I think there's like a particular way, and also we are, we're in partnership with, in a relationship with organizations that are large scale organizations that are for immigrant, for doing work around immigration, doing work around, Black liberation, and so on and so forth. And that doesn't necessarily always translate. Like we're not, and those are spaces for which it doesn't feel necessarily appropriate for us to be in the front, or to be super
Hmm.
loud about it. And so we are not being loud about it, but and also we are still in the work and in the, supporting Black feminist organizations, supporting Black reproductive justice organizations. And so we are doing those things. We are in it, and we are supporting again, to Rachel's point around the toolbox, that there are a number of different ways and different communities might engage in different ways, and with different tools and tactics and strategies. And so we want to be cognizant around that, and we want to support folks in showing up in their communities in the ways that feel real and drive impact. And so that's really been our, for me, what I would say has been the crux of our approach there, has been how do we support, how do we flank, how do we build relationship, so that we can lift up that leadership and help drive the work that feels like it's necessary and real for those communities.
And I would say also that I think that the folks who come out in March, um, I think a lot of them think that they're doing what they've been asked to do. Like when you go online and you see, kind of communities of color being like, go get your cousin, you know what I mean? And like, go show dissent, go do this, go, so come to trainings and figure out how to. One of our most attended trainings of the past like 6 months was this training that we did with Leaving MAGA about how to talk to your MAGA, family members, because I think that what we've seen is like folks who are like white folks who are inside of bases who, had family members like in Trump 1.0, they were like, I cut him off. And I think they realized, oh, that wasn't the move. Like he went and made a whole network of friends and now they're a squad. Like now it. And so I think that, there are folks that like the in order to have an unbreakable super majority, at least for some time, like it has to include like white people, and in order for us to break fascism and break MAGA, we also need to wedge inside of their coalition. And so Women's March is a place that's like a place that can do that effectively, because our people didn't vote for Trump, but they probably know people who did. And so we are trying to make interventions with those folks to give them all the tools that they need to be able to have those conversations and those organizing moments inside of their own networks, and then to go forward and make them. And so I'm not sure that it's the role of Black women who voted for Harris, for example, at 92%, to go and organize white folks away from voting MAGA. Like, so I think that there's a certain extent to which the folks who are stepped up and picked up these tools are the folks who need to go and do the work. And so there are different organizing mandates for different, folks at different times, and also in different locations. I think a lot of the critique that comes from this comes from like blue states, the Acela corridor, or even blue cities inside of red states. And I'll tell you that coming from a place in Amarillo, Texas, a very red part where we, played a role in local organizing around some reproductive issues. We're now in the, in the ground tussling around data centers. It's that also this body of work looks different locally than it does nationally, and it looks different every day than it looks in a one-time march, and it looks different, so it's just important. There's a lot of men involved, for example, for women's march initiatives. And so all of that said is that there's a time and a place, a literal time and a literal place, and different roles inside of the movement. And that just speaks again to the role and the need of decentralization. Because if we're not talking about these big marches, which, although women's marches are named, we do not believe that marches are the end. They are the beginning. They're the beginning of they're an on-ramp. And so if we don't make the fatal error, and I don't, use that lately, but the fatal error of thinking that any one organization or any one mobilization is the movement, if we understand that we all play a role inside of that, and that there are times that those roles are more forward and more back, and that different people will come in at different times to play certain roles in order to move the work forward, versus moving a brand forward, versus moving an institution forward as an answer to fascism, then I think the more that these questions around who is where, when, become less relevant, and what work needs to be done in order to move us all forward takes front and center. And then we're not worried about like the who, we're worried about the what. And for me, when I'm sitting inside of a movement where I'm like, I don't hear a coherent movement response, like we should all be singing from the same prayer book right now on what is our response to MAGA, what is our counter narrative and our counter proposal to the American people around MAGA? What is our counter proposal around Trump and his leadership? And what is our counter to Project 2025? And we don't have that. And so instead we talk about the who, because we don't have the what in place yet. And until we have Anat Shankar-Osorio, who I'm sure your listeners, have heard, even if you haven't heard her, you've heard her messaging, I guarantee it. Whenever I give her something, she gives it back to me marked up. And she says, you stay talking about the recipe, and the American people want to hear about the brownie. And I think some of this question, of like, who is at the marches or whatever, and what are the marches? Like the marches themselves are still the recipe. Like, what's the brownie? And as a left, women's marches, that's bigger than us. But as a left, we have to articulate the brownie. Like, it is imperative, because otherwise we'll win this next election, and then we will be in the most important election of our lives every 2 years until we die. That is just what will happen.
And that is not a brownie. That's like a...
It's not a brownie. It is brown.
That's like a lame Rice Krispie treat or something. So here's my last question. How are you going to move the needle to take a step forward? I mean, we've got so many things happening simultaneously. We've got lots and lots of people, women and also others, who really want to do something. I mean, the data are very clearly giving you, a push to say, help us. So what's next?
I mean, I think what we're up to is trying to articulate the brownie. Which I think, we've been playing with some things. One of them is Free America as a frame, as sort of an experiment with what can be a counter to MAGA. But we're also continuing to give people the skills and the training and the invitation into consistent non-cooperation into sustainable non-cooperation. So we just rolled out sort of an offering that we're calling Brave Women, where we're doing non-cooperation trainings, inviting folks to not only take small everyday acts of refusal, but also to track it and to put it into into the bucket so we can see how many acts of refusal can we get from everyday folks. So that's one of the things. So the Brave Women is sort of our invitation into everyday acts of refusal and of non-cooperation. We're also planning, to be building around this Free America frame, to be building towards a Free America agenda. So we're about to, in the summer, we'll be rolling out assemblies across the country, building delegations to come together with us in 2027, to really think about, how do we bring delegates together? How do we ratify a Free America agenda collectively that is feminists from all stripes across the country, from urban and rural areas, from different demographics to come together and say, this is what we're seeing in our communities. This is actually a vision that we have for what's next. And then now we're going to scale up so that we can actually execute a strategy related to this agenda. So that's sort of, that's where we're about to be. That's what we're up to now. Rachel, I know we have a lot of things that we're about to be up to for a team of 12. But
We're like, we never heard of biting off less than you can chew. We're always like more. I would just say, the Brave Women pieces, and we're also up to a couple of other programmatic offerings. And the first is been going on for a long time, and that's Digital Defenders. And that's a group of people who are in a posture of activism in their digital networks that they're already in. And so you might be a crafter. As somebody right before I got on here, somebody said, I just sent out this call to action to my quilting circle, and I thought I was going to get the business. And like from all of these, how she described it on Threads was these older white women came back and they were like, say less, and they gave all this money and did all this stuff. And so like, where are your networks organized there? So we're trying to give folks the skills so that they can take it back out. That's been going on for a number of years, and now we're going to continue to be up to that. We also have women's protection teams, as we know that folks have questions about safety and security, both in protest spaces and election spaces, but sometimes just going to the doctors. And, there are some places that have gotten to feel unsafe, and so the ways in which we can fortify ourselves and our communities around us so that we can de-escalate things, but also be able to be in a posture of self-defense if somebody is attacked in an era of your body, our choice. One of the things we know about fascism is that domestic violence goes up, sexual assault goes up, and there's a bunch of correlated criteria, like in violence against women, that goes up inside of authoritarian regimes and democratic backsliding. So we want to be prepared for that. And then finally, and this thing that I've become obsessed with is this idea of keeping the record. And I kind of fell into a rabbit hole around Mormonism this summer and came to understand that they've got temples, but inside of their temples they've got wards, and there's a guy that's responsible for each ward, and it's his role to record what happens inside the ward and to mitigate the conflicts and things that happen. And one of the things that I began to think about, and why we know so much about Mormonism, they've kept assiduously accurate records, and they all live at Brigham Young. And so, like, what does it look like to be the record keeper? What does it look like to tell the story? And if on one side, this the if history is written by the victor, can the win be written by the random person? Can we make records? Can we fight off the onslaught and the attack on memory? Like, Orwell said that the person that the I'm going to get the quote wrong, but it's like, he who controls the narrative of the past controls the future. And if they strip our books and they strip our schools and they strip our museums of what we know to be our history, and an incomplete telling of that, then the control that we give them over our present and our future becomes unprecedented. And so, can we be the keepers of our own history and our own present and write our own future? And also have an account with which to hold these, frankly, war criminals accountable when that day comes, which I believe it will, of the people's history of what happened and what they experienced in their communities, and what, the atrocity of not just the state-based violence that we, see in policy, but the atrocity of, your baker or your local postman who, left that job and went to become an ICE agent and then began operating in your community. What is the record of that? So that isn't something that, gets lost as one day everyone will have been against this, um, as the meme says. So I've become really obsessed with the idea of keeping the record and being the keepers of the flame for our own memory and our own history.
It's all about bearing witness, right?
Hmm.
Well, I just have to say, I know it's an old, tired saying, but I really enjoyed spending time with you two nasty women. Um,
And
I'm
our
reaching back a little bit into our history a little bit, but I mean,
yeah.
but Rachel and Tamika, thank you for sharing your time with me. This is, this conversation was very much an opportunity to talk about what's broken, but how we're definitely going to fix it. And I am
Hmm.
so much more hopeful about how we're going to do just that by talking to you all and learning a lot more about what Women's March is doing. So thank you again.
Thank
Thanks for
you.
having us.
Thanks for having me.